Well, Putin, if you listen to Putin's speech last night, he's obviously fed up. He's had it up to here with the West ignoring Russia's legitimate security concerns. The West has got one narrative, Russia's got a completely different narrative. And the way Putin described it, these grievances, these accumulated 30 plus years of grievances, Putin just sees as having pushed him past his limit. He was not only angry, he was enraged. And we could see this building. I go back to March 1st, 2018, his State of the Nation address, which I see as a real turning point. The U.S. had now said that the main threats to American security is not global terrorism, it's Russia and China. And the U.S. security statement at that point, the U.S. had put out its new nuclear posture review. The U.S. was clearly talking about a new Cold War with Russia and China. And Putin says in that speech, where he announces that Russia has 5 new nuclear weapons, all of which can circumvent U.S. missile defense, he says, "You didn't listen to us. Listen to us now." The West did not listen. And then he's simply been escalating this. You could trace this back to 2007. We just talked about the 15th anniversary of his 2007 Munich speech, where again he lays this out. He says American unipolarity is terrible for the world and for the United States. He says that the U.S. has become a hyper-militarist state, invading other countries at will. He says that NATO's expanded to Russia's border. This is not anything new. If anybody's been alert, paying any attention, they knew that something was coming. And the troop buildup clearly presaged something major happening. I was very disappointed by what Putin said yesterday. This is a terrible mistake and unjustified, in my opinion, precisely because he had actually finally captured the attention and interest of the West. I mean, what he'd been doing with the mobilization and the other statements had made clear how serious Russia is about demanding the West pay attention and take serious Russia's national security concerns. And when it comes to Ukraine and the Donbass, there was the Minsk II agreement from 2015, which now Germany and France and Hungary and other countries were talking about. And so even though Zelensky didn't want to talk about it, and Biden hasn't really wanted to talk about it, the world was moving toward more diplomacy. I thought this was a great opportunity for Putin to declare victory, say that we said all along we weren't going to invade. We just wanted diplomacy. We wanted serious discussions of this, and then to diffuse the tensions, to withdraw the forces, and give diplomacy a chance. He could always bring those troops back to the border there. But giving diplomacy a chance now, when given the energy situation, and given the military balance of forces in the region, and given the new political concerns and geopolitical concerns, he was in a very good position to do that. And unfortunately, he went the opposite direction. It's only the first tentative step, and it's possible to limit this before there's a real disaster, but it does not look promising. And if we look at Putin's words, listen to Putin's words from last night's speech, it does not look promising. These points have a lot of legitimacy as part of the timing that the West does not appreciate. That there's been, in 2019, when Zelensky came to power, he said he's going to have a friendly relation with Russia and he's going to resolve the conflict. And he began to have meetings, and it looked like they were moving toward some kind of understanding. And then there was so many protests against him for appeasing Russia, for being conciliatory to Russia, and somehow they accused him of selling out Ukrainian interests. So big demonstrations. The right wing mobilized against him, but there are also some more democratic elements mobilizing against him, and he caved in. He capitulated to that, and then he arrests Russia's most friendly oligarch in Ukraine, puts him under house arrest. He shuts down 3 friendly to Russia television networks. He starts talking bad about Putin and Russia, accusing them of aggression. And then, on top of that, he gets more weapons from the West and from NATO. He has more NATO trainers inside Ukraine. And so Putin's looking at this, and he sees that what's developing, they refer to as an anti-Russia on Russia's borders. And we know, going way back, as you say, we can trace this back to 1990. The promises given, the assurances given verbally and not in writing to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. We could trace it back to the discussion. We know that later that year, that same year in 1990, the National Security Council was already meeting and discussing NATO expansion and saying we should tell the former Soviet republics that we're going to be open to NATO expansion in the future. They didn't say that publicly, of course, but they were giving the message. And if you look at even Yeltsin, rollover sycophant Yeltsin, who was giving up anything that the United States wanted, strongly was opposing NATO expansion and making clear that. Look at the documents that were released by the National Security Archives about 1994 and Yeltsin's position there. And then in 1997, we've got about 50 top U.S. diplomats and foreign policy experts pressing Clinton not to expand NATO, saying this is a terrible decision. You've got George Kennan. You've got people who are hawks like Paul Nitze, all recognizing that this is at a time when Russia was trying to be America's friend and ally. Why expand an anti-Russian military alliance to Russia's doorstep? So they expand beginning in 1999. And then in 2004, they expand 7 more countries, including the Baltic states, to Russia's borders. But what happened before that, in 2001, after the U.S. gets attacked on 9/11, the first foreign leader to lend support to the U.S. and to contact George W. Bush was Vladimir Putin. Putin had been even talking about Russia joining NATO, as crazy as that idea might be. He wanted friendly relations. Then in 2002, the U.S. pulls out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. 2003, the U.S. invades Iraq over the opposition not only of Germany and France, but Russia and much of the rest of the world on false pretenses. 2004 expands NATO. So we see this developing. 2007, he gives that talk at the Munich Security Conference and says, stop this crazy aggression, military aggression and NATO expansion. And then 2008, George W. Bush kicks him in the teeth and says at the NATO meeting that Putin actually was attending for the first time. Then George W. Bush announces that we want to expand NATO to include Ukraine and Georgia. It's followed up by the Russian intervention into Georgia. And then there was a period of relative calm, at least a brief period of relative calm. But in 2008, that's when the current CIA director, William Burns, sends that memo back to Washington. Niet means niet, it's titled. Don't cross Russia's red lines when it comes to Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. It's interesting that Burns, current head of the CIA, wrote a memoir 2 years ago called The Back Channel, in which he repeats this and says it was a terrible mistake to try to expand NATO. NATO expansion initially was a mistake. And he also says that all Russians are united against NATO expansion and against, even stronger, against Ukraine becoming part of NATO. So what happened most recently is Zelensky started again beating the drums for NATO incorporation of Ukraine joining NATO. He made a big deal about this the last year or so. What I think in some ways was the final straw was Zelensky's speech on Saturday. Zelensky had been a voice of relative calm and moderation. He had criticized the United States. Putin sees him as a puppet of the United States, but he's created a lot of distance between American position and Ukraine's position. And he said all this war talk coming out of Washington and other European countries, especially Britain, all this war talk about the imminence of a Russian invasion was wrong. It was unfounded on the evidence, and it was also very, very destructive, very dangerous. And that was his line until Saturday. Then he makes a very alarmist speech again, calls for immediate sanctions, not to delay the sanctions, to impose them immediately. And he says that this is the last straw for the Bucharest Memorandum. The Bucharest Memorandum goes back to 1994, and that's the agreement which the Russians, you can argue, have also broken, that Ukraine's sovereignty will be recognized and supported in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons that it had had under the Soviet period. Ukraine does give up those nuclear weapons, but implicitly what Zelensky was saying on Saturday was that now this is all off. Ukraine can again pursue developing its own nuclear weapons. We know there's a lot of infrastructure there. We know there's a lot of scientific and technological expertise there. Putin heard that. Putin talked about that in his speech last night. It's interesting. I started getting frantic calls from the Russian media Saturday evening. We were going over a friend's house for dinner. One Russian TV station actually sent a cameraman to my friend's apartment to interview me, but I did 4 interviews over that night and the next morning about the threat of nuclear weapons. I scoured the Western press. There was not a single mention in the Western press of what the implications, what Zelensky said were in terms of Ukraine developing nuclear weapons. But I knew that we were in for it at that point. I knew that that was going to be the last straw, and that was going to, in some ways, precipitate a stronger Russian reaction. So I wasn't surprised, but I was deeply disappointed. It was the wrong thing to do at the wrong time, and it's not eased the tensions, it's heightened the tensions.